Good morning. I am joined by Julie Phillips and Laura Cunningham, and they both have spent a lot of time out in the field on public lands and BLM lands and Park Service lands. All three of us have in common a love for the Tule elk. And why are these two people qualified to talk about this topic? So let's have them introduce themselves. Julie, give us a little background.
Hi, Skyler. Thank you. I started tracking elk in early 1980, and as part of working under contract with California Department of Fish and Game as a grad student, and then eventually continued working on herds, looking at herd elk locations throughout the state. And then after I was done with that, became a community college instructor and taught about elk and other animal science topics. But I spent really over 30 some years trying to locate the herds that Fish and Game were identifying and trying to do counts where we could get onto both public and private lands, and took students into the field doing wildlife corridor studies around the elk. And so I published my Tule elk guide, which kind of gives the public overview of how important Tule elk are to the state.
And where can people find that guide?
They can go to my naturebasedteaching.com website, or they can contact me at tuleelk@comcast.net, and I'll send them a copy of the PDF of the guide.
Naturebasedteaching.com. Mm-hmm. Also joined by Laura Cunningham. Laura, please give us a little background.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I also worked for California Department of Fish and Game back in the 90s. So with some of the Owens Valley Tule elk, and did some other wildlife biology work, wrote a book called A State of Change, Forgotten Landscapes of California, which just went out of print. And I'm in the process of uploading it. Yeah, I'm uploading it onto a free online distance curriculum website now, but it has paintings and illustrations of what I imagined California to look like before European contact, with abundant herds of Tule elk and coastal prairies and Native American tribes. And currently I'm the California director for a conservation group, Western Watersheds Project.
This book, the book that Laura just talked about, holy moly, does it have a lot of information in it. It's almost intimidating how much knowledge is in here, but it is worth reading, and it is a testament to how much time Laura has put into the history of California. Maybe that's a good place to start, because I'm looking at some of the maps that Julie provided and about where elk are located or were located, and the dwindling numbers that are spread out in a couple of spots around the state. And what I keep thinking about is what California once looked like before contact, before European colonization. And what's the best proof that we have of what the landscape looked like? Laura, you wrote a book on that topic. What's the best evidence we have to show how California once looked?
Well, we have the oral tradition from Native people themselves, who are the utmost authority. I've talked to elders who have stories of when Spanish people came and kicked them out of their villages. That is how long their memories go on the Colorado River. We have the settlers, the colonialists who came, Europeans, wrote extensive diaries from the Spanish to the American. Sir Francis Drake described seeing a very large herd of fat deer at the Drake's Bay area when his men took a little ship off of their sailing ship. This was in the 1500s. And deer are the equivalent of elk. The European red deer is almost identical to our elk, our North American elk. We have paintings from the 1700s and 1800s that show the glory of California abundance with waterfowl and herds of pronghorn antelope, elk, salmon. And we also have relics of native plants. We have the history of the elk, which I'm sure Julie can talk about, of how they were shot by market hunters in the 1800s during the gold rush relentlessly until they were like less than a dozen left. So we have so many good sources of information, history, oral traditions, maps and illustrations. We also have science evidence such as pollen from deep cores in lakes and ponds. You can actually extract pollen, carbon date it, and then you can see how the vegetation has shifted over thousands of years in California. And there are so many different sources of scientific information about what the past looked like. But in a nutshell, I mean, I was able to like research for 20 years how diverse the research is and the sources to put this together. And I could have kept writing more in that book, but the publisher said, enough, we gotta stop. So there's plenty of evidence of what California looked like.
Julie, anything to add to that?
I wholeheartedly agree. And I think what's really cool is we still can see remnants of all the important habitat types for Tule elk. So throughout, you can see the oak woodlands, the oak savannas, the grasslands. There's not many of the native grasslands left, but at least those open areas that could be restored. We found some remnants of the perennial bunch grasses down at Pacheco State Park. So we've been kind of over the last 20 some years trying to find those remnants. But again, in many of the private ranches still, like Hewlett Packard Ranch and some of those, they still have nice stands of the oaks. Down at Pacheco, you can still find the blue oaks. I mean, it's just, there are remnants still, even with all the people, but because the lands have been held in private, you know, cattle operations, so on, there still are some remnants left in some of those more responsible ranches. So you still can see, and I assume Laura would say the same about Point Reyes, there's still some examples of the coastal prairie left. But again, most of that place is pretty dead, but at least there's remnants so that people can learn how do we restore this native habitat. And that's really the place that we're at in terms of environmental science right now, is how do we look at what's remaining and how do we use landscape ecology and restoration ecology to begin to restore what we have and protect what's left. So I think there's still hope in that sense.
Just to be clear for our listeners, those remnants are not found on pastoral lands or grazing grounds.
At Point Reyes or, yeah.
No.
Yeah. Good point.
No, definitely the only relative.
I know the answer to that because
No,
Laura took me out there. Laura took me out there and we surveyed the land ourselves and identified plants ourselves. So the answer is
Point Reyes is the most degraded of all the 20 some herds. I've never seen. Point Reyes is one of the most degraded, probably next to Carrizo Plains National Monument. I mean, it's just devastated because of the cattle operation. So there are very few remnants for people to see of what was originally there.
this national park, this national seashore that is supposed to be a model, as some people say, for ranching and wildlife to coexist, is the worst you've seen, including private lands and other public lands outside of the seashore.
Yeah, I mean, the ecosystem has been completely converted from deep, lush, deep-rooted native perennial bunch grasses and wildflowers with rare plants, which you now only find outside of the fence where no cattle can be. I've not seen these native coastal prairies anywhere in a cow pasture. They're just remnant. Like you can drive along the roadside and you see bunches of Pacific reed grass outside the fence. And inside the fence, it turns into, most years, a very shallow-rooted annual European grassland with weeds like poison hemlock and thistle, milk thistle. This year, the pictures I've seen from you all during this extreme drought, it's bare dirt by the end of the summer, bare dirt. And so it's just completely, it's the worst managed public land I have ever seen. And I work all over the state of California with U.S. Forest Service, Bureau of Land Management. I even work with regional parks and state parks. And Point Reyes takes the cake. I mean, not only is it bare dirt, they're pastures with slurries of liquefied cow manure all over them. Unbelievable.
Yeah, Laura, you showed me these things. It's in my film and it's in the mini movies that Laura and I have made together. And if anyone doubts what we're saying, you can see it for yourselves. And when I present this to people, you know, sometimes the pro ranching community jumps in defense of the ranches, and you hear arguments like, well, poop is natural. You know what? You think we should go and kill all wild animals because they poop too? And, you know, it's a pretty ridiculous argument, but it brings me back to wanting to talk about what California looked like. Because before humans reduced wild animals to what, 6% of what remains on the planet or something like that, they were all out there eating each other and pooping, and yet the land was beautiful biodiversity. We had 500,000 Tule elk throughout California. Did California look like degraded landland with all those animals running around?
Well, if you think about the Tule Elk Range as far north as Mount Shasta, along the foothills of the Sierra to the east, down to Bakersfield and along the coast, you kind of see mainly oak savanna, oak woodlands, native grasslands, coastal prairies. So that's kind of the habitat. They were never found in the forest, so on. So just so people have that visual. But look what happened to those areas. Like look in Santa Clara County. The humans arrived and humans started to take over more and more of the habitat. So the elk were pushed off much of those lands. The places where they remained were mainly some public lands, but private ranches as well. And some of those private ranches have managed their lands fairly well, which have allowed for some elk to survive. So there's just been this, but they were basically driven off by human population, human choices, freeways, highways, they're disconnected. So if you can visualize that elk should, you know, we have 25 herds, there's almost no connectivity between those herds. So the animals of Point Reyes, it would be wonderful if we could, I talked about how would we connect them, create a corridor to other areas. Well, it would be almost impossible. So that's one of the problems. There's genetically isolated herds now that can't move between different areas. So it creates this other set of challenges.
So I'm going to put a marker up to come back and talk about genetic bottleneck as a problem. Laura, did you want to add something about the biodiversity of California and its health when there actually were more animals pooping?
Well, think of early California as a land of no fences. There are grizzly bears roaming, 1,000 square miles. And the Tule elk probably were able to migrate over long distances. They might have summered down in the Central Valley marshes that were green, the Delta, lush waters, snowmelt waters all summer. Then perhaps they migrated in the winter to the foothills and the Coast Range to get above, floodwaters. So the poop didn't concentrate in a couple of acres around a, feeding trough, a confined animal feeding operation. Those don't exist 1,000 years ago. And plus the Tule elk pellets. I mean, Skyler, you and I saw them. They're tiny. They're not this big cow pie. And the elk are minimal in numbers. Their muzzle is smaller compared to thousands of dairy cows, which weigh 2 to 3 times even a bull elk. And they're highly concentrated in these barns that produce tons of manure a day that has to be disposed of. I mean, it's an industrial agricultural operation on our national park. And there was never such a thing in early California before Europeans.
And I'll add to that, as speaking on behalf of maybe, your average city dweller who thinks about a wild elk, and you might think of this gigantic animal, which is actually significantly smaller than a livestock cow, beef and dairy. In fact, the dairy cattle outweigh them by almost 50%. And in addition to that, which you sort of alluded to, Laura, they are nearly forced to overeat. They just constantly consume in order to output a product. And therefore, in the process of that, they're also outputting a fecal matter product that has to be dealt with. There's eating for industry, and then there's wild animal grazing, which produces very different amounts of poop.
The elk are a grazer and a browser, so they, they're a selective feeder. They'll feed and they'll graze for a while in the grasses, bunch grasses, annual grasses, and then they'll browse on shrubs and so on, and maybe the oak leaves and so on. So they're moving throughout the land, and when they poop, basically, it's native stuff. So it disintegrates, dissolves, decomposes into the soils, which help enhance the soils. So they're not, they're really, whereas the cattle are eating mainly annual, exotics in many cases. So the Tule elk evolved with these native, so they were part of the natural ecosystem. And it's hard for people to kind of visualize that nowadays, because what they see from all their cars and freeways is pretty much non-native exotic landscape. So it's very difficult for them to visualize that.
What a great point. And now you're getting into the small scientific details that are extremely interesting, but for a lot of us, we just overlook it. They're eating plants. It's as simple as that to a lot of people. But eating native plants actually has a positive effect on the fertilizer that goes back into the soil versus fertilizing it with fecal matter that came from plants that weren't supposed to be there in the first place. How interesting.
Plus, they don't destroy the plants. So that if there's perennial bunch grasses they're munching on, they'll eat it a little bit and move, but they won't eat it all the way down the roots. The cattle will eat every friggin' part of it. They'll go all the way down. Some of those root structures are huge in some of those perennial bunch grasses. Sometimes they say 3 to 4 feet or more below the surface. Cattle will just keep on it until they kill it. Whereas the elk won't do that. They just feed a little bit and shift. And when I was in the field, I was constantly moving. I get settled down from it, then I'll watch for a while. There was always movement, because they were just, unless they were bedded down, but they were always shifting within that range.
I saw an example of that. I was there when the park ranger tried to show Dan Noyes a adequate water source, which was, some mud, and all around that dry seep, or whatever they want to call it, were some plants that had been grazed on with elk tracks around there, but a significant portion of the plant remained. Why do cattle eat the entire plant? Like, did whatever animal they were bred from, did the instinct of not destroying your food source get bred out of them over time? Or how do we explain that difference between livestock animals and wild grazing animals?
I would just say because they're fenced, they don't have a choice. Don't you think in most areas, Laura, maybe you'd agree with me on that, but they're fenced, they're captive, they can't go anywhere. So the places where you see them on ranches and public lands, they have no choice but to eat every single drop. I can't see at Point Reyes how some of those cattle are even surviving. It is so heavily grazed. And obviously they move them out at some point and shift them, but they waited too long to shift them, in my opinion. So there's just nothing else for them to do.
It's a great point.
Yeah, well, and I say too,
Laura.
I say too that, I agree that there's a phrase stocking rate, and the stocking rate of cattle on Point Reyes, the beef and dairy, is just way too high. It's over the carrying capacity of the land. And think of a dairy cow. They are lactating females, and they need huge amounts of calories. I've read that lactating females milking require as much calories as an Olympic athlete to just keep taking in food to produce all that milk and an artificially high level of milk. So what the dairies have to do at Point Reyes is supplement their feed. They've already grazed off in their little pastures those meager annual grasses and weeds. Some of the weeds are so unpalatable that they're not even eaten by anything. They have to supplement the dairy cows with trucked in alfalfa hay, probably grown in the Central Valley where it's warm, releasing carbon. And then they grow silage, which is a kind of moist hay composed of grains like rye, oats, wheat. There's field pea, mustard and radish, which are actually invasive weeds. And the mustard and radish get carried like into the Tamales Elk Reserve. So they have to harvest the silage, and Skyler has horrific videos showing probably nesting birds, deer, fawns getting ripped up by the harvesting machines on a national park. So all of this is fed supplementally to the dairy cows. The beef cows probably get hay supplements too at the end of summer when they've eaten all of the grass. So yeah, the Tule elk have to fend for themselves.
Yeah, out there right now, it looks like a wasteland. You know, it's the conditions are rough enough to where, you know, even the weeds are struggling. And the cattle are just walking around on dirt and poop. So if you want to feel good about an organic dairy of free ranging cows that walks around on dirt and poop, and pretty much the only thing that they're eating is what's trucked in for them.
And that's some of the driest soils I've ever seen. The soil looks like it's just, that soil ecosystem just dead, because we were standing out there for hours and literally I was kind of walking along the fence line there. The soil, I'm sure Laura can speak to this, the soil ecosystem is so critical, but it's basically dead looking to me. I can't imagine microorganisms can survive some of that are essential for the native landscape.
Laura and I basically found a mini rainforest one time when we went out there. It was so inspiring to see the soil crusts and the little microorganisms growing and working together. And, you know, it smelled good, and, you know, it felt good. The energy was good, and it felt like the land had a chance, as opposed to down in that grazing land where it's like, I can't imagine anything recovering.
Yeah, something called biological soil crusts live on the ungrazed parts of the seashore. And we found they're like a couple of inches high, which is pretty high for lichens, mosses, mushrooms, but also underground, the filaments, the mycorrhizae of the mushrooms, the fungi, the roots of these mosses and lichens, but also blue-green algae and other types of algae have these filaments that make a network under the soil. I mean, this is actually carbon farming, not farming, but carbon sequestration. You have the deep-rooted perennial bunch grasses, and the roots actually interconnect with the fibers of the biological soil crust several feet down. And when you have cows, the cows just come, like Julie said, they trample, they eat, and they destroy all of this. And when you destroy all the above ground living biomass, what's underground is killed too. And the cows basically turn this miniature rainforest of a coastal prairie into a dead soil, especially during a drought.
If anyone wants to see a visual representation of what Laura just described, I'll put the link in the description of this to the video that she and I made together, because it really was cool to see it happening out there. But I'm not going to add it to this video. And I've brought this up with both of you multiple times, but I feel like it has to be said. Cows have hooves, elk have hooves. There's the fact that the elk are able to free roam while the cows are kind of fenced in, so that adds to more trampling. But is there more to it in the manner that a wild animal walks amongst these animals? You know, the adaptation of animals that evolved with the land, and how that helps them not destroy their own surroundings as they move through it. Would either of you like to try to get into the nitty-gritty details of that?
Well, I would just throw in a couple comments that, as I mentioned, the elk are selective feeders, and the deer and so on, they're selective feeders. So they don't sit and eat something or trample on something till it's gone. They're kind of constantly moving. And so they work with the bunch grasses, they work with the shrubs, they work with the little oaks. I mean, little native blue oaks and so on. We've seen them regenerating in elk habitat. So we know that they're not eating every single little seedling from those trees, which is incredible. If there were cattle in there, there would be none of that. So cattle, just the sheer weight, the way that they feed, the way they just grab everything, you know, they don't stop. And I think the pure numbers of cattle are another serious problem. They're just, usually when cattle operations are occurring, there's just so many cattle trying to maximize that land area that I think that creates a problem as well.
Laura?
Yeah, and the hoof shape and size of cows and elk are really different. I mean, you can go out and see it on Point Reyes. A cow, I mean, is literally this big. I mean, it's huge and it's round. Elk are this shape. They have more pointed cloven hooves and they're just much smaller. So it's a much smaller, literally footprint on the grasses and the delicate biological soil crusts. And like Julie said, they are a wild animal. They're not bred to just stay and eat at a feeding trough. They move around. They're always walking. I've seen it too. Cows are bred to maximize meat on the bone or milk in the udder. So they're not bred to have long legs. Elk have very long legs. They're good at roaming. Cows are bred, our domestic cows are bred to stay put and grow meat.
And yet, in almost complete contradiction to what you two both just described, we're hearing about regenerative farming. Regenerative farming, how wonderful it is to use cows to regenerate the land. Why isn't anyone trying to include native grazers in regenerating land? Julie?
Well, I think Laura could speak to this probably too, but I think really this whole concept that regenerative, I was looking it up, the selective farming, regenerative farming enhances and creates healthy soils is ridiculous. They're saying they're basically trying to enhance the natural ecosystem, which is impossible with cattle. It's not possible. And nowhere in California where we've seen cattle can you see any signs of this regenerative farming, or it doesn't, it's not fighting climate change, it's actually enhancing climate change. So the elk could allow us to do that because we need to go to the concept of landscape ecology and restoration ecology, where the elk, the deer, and the other native organisms are allowed to rehabilitate, restore themselves in the landscape. That's the only way we're going to really see these natural, healthy ecosystems again. Cattle aren't solving it. It's a term they just use. They're bouncing around and confusing the public with, but it is irresponsible. And within a national park, they should have the highest standard. So that kind of work should be done with the native organisms, and to have Point Reyes pushing the cattle operations over native elk or deer or other organisms, it really violates the mission of a national park.
Laura? Anything to add?
Yeah, I agree. I agree. The closest I've ever seen to a regenerative ranch was owned by a billionaire hobby farmer, and I got to tour it, the Tomcat Ranch. Kat was really a nice hostess. Her husband is Tom Steyer, so she didn't really need to make a profit off of cows, but she did a pretty good job of trying to aim towards this whole regenerative ranching goal. But the visiting the ranch was very instructive because she had a very low stocking rate for the acreage. There weren't that many cows. She could hire dozens of hands to manage the land. They had the area divided into a rotation grazing system with pastures, maybe 10 different pastures, and all week long, the cowboys would herd the cows through the system of pastures, which creates a lot of barbed wire fence, by the way. But it did allow some of the pastures to rest, and they had more annual grass height. It was still not the perennial bunch grasses, but at least it was rested. Now at Point Reyes, they do not do this at all. They throw huge numbers of cows out on a pasture all year long, season long. There's no rest. These pastures get no rest. So we see your descriptions at the end of September, bare dirt, powdered dead soil, bare dirt. So I think the theory of regenerative ranching could allow for better management. I mean, the Tomcat Ranch, they fence off all riparian areas. Cows are not allowed in any water at all. So she had a bigger biodiversity of birds and willows. They don't do that at Point Reyes either. Cows are in the water, they're trampling streams. So the theory of regenerative ranching, it's also called holistic management after Alan Savory's work, is possibly good, but nobody can afford to do it. I mean, your average rancher, he needs to maximize the number of cows on the land. He can't spare the grass over there for 6 months. You know, they just can't afford to do that. So I just don't think that 99% of ranchers in California can afford to do regenerative ranching as the theory. And I've only seen it on billionaire hobby ranches.
May I make a comment on that too? I think that's excellent points, Laura. And I think the real question here is what's appropriate on public lands. So if you have private lands, and most of California is private lands for grazing. So what they do on their land, if they would have a higher standard, that would be phenomenal. But in this case at Point Reyes National Seashore, this land belongs to the public. It doesn't belong to the cattle ranchers. So they can't throw around their terminology, and they're misleading the public and the national park staff, because that's not what's happening at Point Reyes. And when it belongs to the public, the native wildlife should take priority over non-native domestic livestock. I just don't understand it. And that they're talking about expanding their crops, expanding their domestic livestock is absolutely in violation of what public land should be. And again, remember, there's 3 categories of federal lands. There's restricted use lands, there's moderately restricted, and multiple use lands like our forests. Point Reyes is the most restricted. They're restricted use lands. They're the national park system. So that's where we have to say the native wildlife is the highest priority. Cattle need to be removed. And I don't understand why that's such a hard concept. I know the cattle ranchers are quite influential, but the bottom line is Melanie Gunn and that whole team know that these are public lands, and the public is rising up to say, we want our native wildlife there.
I want to say a few things in response to what you both said. You know, how inspiring would it have been for the Tomcat Ranch and the billionaire to go ahead and bring in some native animals and watch that regenerative farming, since it's a hobby anyway. But why are we having to look at a ranch outside of the national seashore for a nice example of how it could be done in harmony with the earth to some extent, rather than in Point Reyes National Seashore, where that exact same line is promoted endlessly, that they are the model for how a small organic ranching operation should look like, when in reality, they're degrading land in order to, I guess, reach profit margins. And as you've both alluded to, and pretty much anyone familiar with dairy and beef know, it's hard to make those profit margins. And so then you have the narrative, well, don't you feel bad for these ranchers? We've got to do everything we can to help them. But at the same time, we're supposed to be happy about, look how wonderful this small scale operation is. And whether you're on the ranching side of this or the wildlife side of it, both of those can't be true. Is it a model of a small operation, or is it people that we're sympathizing with and are going to let them degrade the land any way that they want to in order to earn a dollar?
Well, don't you think it's really important, Skyler, to keep bringing up the fact that these people were paid for the land? They basically, land was bought. It's time for their leases were expired. It's time for them to go. And it's time for an opportunity. But standing out there this weekend, just looking out there, what an opportunity to use as a classroom, to take Point Reyes National Seashore and make it a national classroom where students come out and help restore the native landscape. They get to follow the native elk. They get to see the restoration of the deer populations, the coyotes, the badgers. It would be an amazing place for them. And I was just sitting there, I just had goosebumps kind of looking out, because I was just looking at this devastation, thought, this is the classroom of the 21st century. Point Reyes National Seashore should become a model for, we've come to this moment, these people need to leave. It's not going to be easy to get them to leave. But now begins the process of restoration ecology. And again, to have and again, there were so many young people out at this protest that to have people and different organizations involved, you know, Western Watersheds, I mean, you're just the work, the leadership work of all these groups, it would be a national model. And it would begin the process of transitioning these operations off of public lands, especially in national parks.
I spoke to Todd Howell, a wildlife scientist who worked for the Park Service on Monday. He said it was park policy when they started a restoration process. The first thing they did was get cattle off the land. That was the first step in restoring the habitat. And yet somehow we have this narrative now that is the exact opposite of that. And it's being promoted within Point Reyes National Seashore in particular.
But what's really good about Point Reyes is you have the elk there. So there'd be other ranches that say, we're going to remove the cattle, and then you've got some problems on your hand because maybe you don't have grazers and browsers there. At Point Reyes, the elk are there. So they're in place now to begin this restoration process. And we'll watch how their numbers may slowly increase, but it would be slow over time, 14% or less a year. So it would give us that opportunity to watch, whereas other ranches, it would be difficult because they'd have to reintroduce elk, which is often a challenge itself. So here you've got the perfect scenario. And again, I haven't seen many deer out at Point Reyes. I've seen a few. So we know there's some out there that would help as well. So we've kind of got the basics there for a restoration effort within this national park.
You want to talk about the disconnection of the elk and the how this lack of ability to connect with each other may lead to their extinction either way?
As Laura had mentioned earlier, there were originally 500,000 Tule elk, and it went down to probably less than 20. So it went through what's called a population bottleneck. They lost all those gene alleles. And so over time, the numbers have increased, but again, they still continue to hunt. The elk have been hunted since the rest, I mean, until probably, I think they allowed them to start hunting again in the early 1900s. So as the numbers increased, they allowed hunting again. And again, the hunters take the biggest bulls, so they're losing those gene alleles. So we have 5,700 elk, and we are concerned about the genetic health just in itself. Just are there enough gene alleles for those elk to be able to adapt and adapt to climate change, for instance? Also, you have these herds that are genetically isolated. There's no movement of those genes between those different herds. So one of the things we did early on in the last few years is we looked at how do we connect some of the herds. It's almost impossible to create wildlife corridors for many of these areas, especially in places like Santa Clara County and others. So those elk are genetically isolated. There's no movement among those herds. And again, we have to keep looking at a state level. Are the places where the elk range is where we can reconnect them? Because that further enhances that ability to adapt. Is just, there's a genetic problem within the Tule elk.
When you say impossible, are you referring to roads and fences and cities? Or, okay.
It's very difficult. We just, we looked at Santa Clara County, there's, again, we were looking at Coyote Valley as a connectivity point between the Diablo Range and Santa Cruz Mountains for wildlife in general, not just elk, because they probably wouldn't be in most of the Santa Cruz Mountains. So we just began to look, we began to map it. And there's a whole trend in that direction in California now is how do we create wildlife corridors? But again, there's just a lot of barriers. And then you have to go across private lands that upsets people. They don't want the elk going through. So it's just going to be kind of a long-term challenge for the next generation, I would say.
You provided some interesting data about what a Tule elk population growth rate should be, as opposed to what it is. And you calculated that there should be about 2,455 Tule elk in Point Reyes National Seashore. And with a fence there and what the population should be, I can only imagine the social conflicts that go on amongst those herds and those attempts to create new herds, not to mention other problems in survival. I guess if either of you had to interpret this plan was doomed from the beginning, or with the intention that the elk would die from these complications since they were fenced in like a zoo?
Well, can I just make one comment, Skyler?
Yeah.
The fact that the elk are at, 730 elk in Point Reyes, obviously something's going on in the background. And there's what we call the 3 S's, shoot, shovel, and shut up. So many of the herds that I studied, you know, just the number of animals in those herds never made sense to me. How do they stay at such small numbers? Well, obviously what's happening when people aren't there, when people turn their back, I mean, there's just this kind of agreement across the state of California, and I blame California Department of Fish and Wildlife for this. They allow people to manage their herds. And so I would assume that must be happening at Point Reyes, because even if you have a simple growth rate of 14%, there should be a lot more elk at Point Reyes. So what's happening behind those scenes is pretty obvious. There's things are happening. They're not, you know, we're not finding a lot of dead elk all over the place. So obviously there's management occurring that we don't know about. And Laura, you may want to speak to that as well.
Yeah, and then we have another problem with a severe drought at the Tamaulipas Tule Elk Reserve, which, I mean, we've had our photographers like Matthew Polverosa Klein taking pictures of 15 dead elk and counting. And these aren't old bones and skeletons. You can tell they're recently deceased elk with, you know, fresh carcasses and vultures feeding on them. And, you know, they reduce down each time Matt goes out there and takes pictures. But there's a troubling couple of sentences in the 1998 Point Reyes Tamaulipas Tule Elk Management Plan, which needs to be revised. 1998, that's ancient history now. But there's a couple of sentences that say, basically, I'll paraphrase, the fenced Tule elk population at Tamaulipas Point, we can control it by allowing the elk to suffer and die when those stock ponds dry up. And then we don't have to worry about going and removing them. We'll let nature take its course. This is actually some wording in this management plan that Dave Press, the park ecologist, is following apparently. And I think it's happening this summer. Almost all of these stock ponds are dry or full of mud, like quicksand, that are trapping elk, trying to get to that last bit of mud to drink. The seeps, which is a word for a non-flowing puddle of water, are just mud now too, according to our wildlife photographers. So this elk management plan needs to be revised to say this is actually cruel management of what's basically a wild animal park. I don't even like to use the term zoo, but Tamaulipas Point is like the San Diego Wild Animal Park. And we either need to take the fence down, which I would really prefer, get rid of the cows, or manage this wild animal park in a humane way by, you know, supplying the elk with water. So, I mean, there's that whole, maybe the elk are growing there, but not this year, they're dying. Their population is not increasing, it's now decreasing.
Well, multiple points on what you two just said. I was just out there and I was with Matthew. I saw with my own eyes that the water sources are dried up. I've seen with my own eyes that the elk have died in their attempts to reach water. It's really bad. But going back to the management plan, the 98 management plan that Dave Press and Melanie Gunn quote when they want to, if in fact they have no intention of helping the elk based on that management plan, why the song and dance about monitoring the water? Why the song and dance about a contingency plan or looking into the possibility of bringing in water, when at the end of it all, they're still going to say that our management plan says we weren't going to do that? You know, it just reeks of a distraction to keep the public from getting outraged by the fact that the bottom line is they will not help. And Julie, you're saying this is a lower population than even natural causes can account for. And someone is possibly harvesting elk behind the scenes. Am I overstepping, or is that what you said?
I mean, look at the Drake's Beach, 124, 174, the Lamator. I mean, the whole thing doesn't make any sense to me. You go out there, like we went out there after the thing on Sunday, we just tried to count some elk. We could almost find no free roaming elk in the other parts, the free roaming elk area. To me, it's at a moment in history when that Tamaulipas Point, that fence needs to be taken down. the elk should be free roaming. There shouldn't be captive herds, especially the irresponsible management of those captive herds. There should be no captive herds in a national park. And it's time for the ranchers to go. Was the plan, So I think a lot of things have Melanie Gunn and the leadership or the lack of leadership in that park have not really followed what the plan was to phase out those ranches, restore the natural processes, get rid of, eventually remove those captive elk fences, and let Point Reyes restore itself. It's pretty darn simple in the 21st century. And I would say 91% of the public goes there to see elk. They don't want to see the cattle, and they don't want to see certainly the degraded land. People were really upset about that at that movement on Sunday, that, just the lack, how devastated everything looks. That's our park. So it's time to raise the standard. It's time for the leadership to do their job and to treat elk like this. People should be prosecuted. I'm really sorry that's irresponsible.
I have a multiple choice question that I think will spark another conversation. And if we were to allow something like the fence coming down and free roaming herds, and people talked about the need to manage the population, eventually we talk about predation and the need to have predators. Which of the following is the greatest reason, or you can number these, and you probably have better answers than my multiple choice, but I'm going to throw some out there to get us started. Which of the following is the biggest reason that would never happen, meaning the natural population control by predators? Number one, human fear of predators, i.e. our disconnection from nature and an outcry of seeing anything that has teeth. Ranchers hating predators in conjunction with the threat to their commodity animals. Wildlife services needing to basically reverse their existing policy, which risks exposure of the fact that they pretty much are eradicating wildlife on behalf of animal agriculture. Or hunters who just will not be able to resist shooting these animals that they're seeing free roaming, or other. This time, let's start with Laura. Do you want to take a crack at the multiple choice game?
That's a tough one. I almost want to say all of the above, although I think ranchers is probably number one, and then wildlife services is definitely number two. Hunters, I think, are more regulated and are way down the list. But I'd like to quickly tell a story about how I kind of got in trouble with some colleagues saying, well, maybe someday we could have wolves at Point Reyes. And fellow environmentalists were shocked at that. So there's definitely a fear in California of things that are new. And I just like to tell a quick story that, wolves, I wrote in my book, they used to be in California. They used to naturally even herd elk herds like you see at Yellowstone National Park now, away from overeating willows, or, I don't know if they reduced their population greatly, but they definitely helped control the population with natural predation. Now, I didn't foresee this, but wolves reintroduced themselves back into California, as we know, from Oregon. It started with a lone male that just crossed the border up, went into the Mount Shasta, Mount Lassen area, and now there have been whole packs entering and breeding in California. But I'm signed up for the state reports, and whole packs have disappeared now too over the years. And apparently it could be due to ranchers actually just going out and shooting the entire pack to save their cows. So, I definitely think it could be a possibility where wolves could get down to Point Reyes, because I think not too many people realize that one of the male wolves, I can't remember if it was OR7 or OR9, traveled far down into Northern California. In fact, 100 miles away from Sacramento, the state of the capital of the state. It had a radio collar. So they saw this one male wolf wander over something like 12 or 13 counties in Northern California, just exploring, but they leave a scent trail, a long scent trail that can last months. And so that wolf went back to Oregon, started a pack, but other wolves followed that scent trail. And, you know, it could just be a matter of time where they could get down to Point Reyes if we let them. But I kind of detect fear might also be high up there on the list of not letting wolves re-enter our parks.
I'm going to throw something in before I go to Julie. I'll have to check this. I could have sworn I read a sad story about those wolves confirmed being killed by ranchers. Julie, you want to take a crack at that?
I just totally agree with what Laura's saying. It's incredible. We've been following the restoration of the wolves, so we've been going up to the areas where OR7 and the pack were seen. We've been, you know, we haven't seen the wolves, but we've been tracking them on the maps and just saying, wouldn't this be incredible? I mean, it's so hopeful. Unfortunately, just the landscape challenges of the amount of places they can get killed and shot. And again, I think what Laura said was just the fear of those ranchers. So I think that effort is so important, and this next generation with the whole restoration ecology movement are really going to help in the restoration of our predators. At Point Reyes National Seashore, the ranchers are obviously terrified about these concepts, but these ranchers don't have a choice. They need to leave. So they shouldn't have a choice about what predators are going to be there, what not. That's not their place. It's the purpose of the National Park Service and the people to determine. And I think the coyotes will help. Sometimes the coyotes will take young elk. So there's things that are, you know, mountain lions, I mean, there's just different things that will happen as the predators are protected at Point Reyes National Seashore. I assume they shoot everything that steps into that place. So in restoring it, saying everything that's native, a predator or prey, are protected, including bobcats, coyotes, so on. That really is critical, that we have that standard in place. The ranchers have no say because they should be gone. And then to begin to work on that statewide plan, and that would include the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. There's advocates within that state agency to restore predators, and there's people within that agency that just hate the concept. But the new generation, as they take over more of the leadership roles, the restoration of predators, including the wolves in parts of California, are absolutely essential.
I want to say something to the viewers. The Park Service has a very nicely worded bit about how carefully they're going to monitor and manage wildlife and the new diversification that's going to take place in the National Seashore. But that's bull. It's not possible. It won't happen. We're already going to kill Tule elk. Now we're bringing in pigs and sheep and chickens. How could that possibly not create more conflicts with wildlife that will almost certainly at some point be tempted to try and get in with those commodity animals? Now, to ease people's fear of predators, I want to reference my interview with George Werthner, author and ecologist, and I'll put a link to that in here. George pointed out to me that when people were scared of mountain lions, that the radio collars showed that mountain lions were next to people, but out of sight regularly, and did not bother people. But when someone sees a mountain lion and they raise hell about it, then they go out and shoot the mountain lion. And then another male mountain lion came into the territory to take that one's place, and they shot it. And you do this destructive management until there aren't any adults to teach the young ones what they should and shouldn't hunt and where they should roam and shouldn't roam. We are shooting ourselves in the foot as well as shooting our wildlife. When we, yes, they do have teeth, and yes, anything's possible, but we can't live a life based on killing other things because of our fear of what could happen.
That's a great point, Skyler. And, you know, I was out in the field many, many hours by myself, sometimes 24-hour watches, and there were mountain lions in that habitat. And we knew because there was radio collared mountain lions in the area. I never once felt nervous. I never felt threatened. They say the statistics are you have a bigger chance of dying from a bee sting than being attacked by a mountain lion. There's almost no documented cases of people being attacked by a mountain lion in California. It's very, very rare. And so again, I was more afraid of the ranchers, to be honest. So I've been chased by ranchers, I've been harassed by ranchers. That made me more nervous, except for on those ranches where they were very considerate, which there were those. But again, I never was ever worried about any type of threat by a mountain lion. They just try to avoid, they just basically avoid humans.
Laura.
Yeah, and I'd like to say, I think the number one animal cause of death in California is due to black rats. That's the most dangerous animal in California, followed by domestic dogs. And this is actually a list from the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. Deer hunters get killed more by buck deer than by mountain lions. It's not a known fact, very well known, but male deer, like black-tailed deer, mule deer, the bucks can be dangerous, and when you shoot them, they actually can charge you and gore you with their antlers. That is a higher cause of death in California than by any native predator. And I'd also like to point out that Mid-Peninsula Open Space Preserve District down by San Jose, they actually have a rancher beef cow operations on some of they lease their parkland. And the ranchers were blaming mountain lions for deaths of certain calves. But when the preserve investigated, it turned out to be packs of feral dogs, wow, not mountain lions. So we definitely have we have a long ways to go to accept native predators.
Fear is a powerful weapon when yielded by those who want to manipulate it. And you both know I have a background in shark conservation, and it's the exact same thing. The people that want to kill something will use fear to promote their cause, even if the statistics show that there's nothing to worry about. And fear is not a rational thing. Fear is an emotional thing. Unfortunately.
And one last thing, I think it's really important that we separate out for the public the difference between public and private lands. That's so important. And in the year 2020, the public land should have the highest standard of native species. So I'm not going to tell private landowners what they do with their land. That's, they have to work that out. And hopefully the California Department of Fish and Wildlife will provide some leadership in that area. But on public lands, that's a whole different story. We are demanding in the 21st century that on our public lands, the native prey and predator species, native plants, all that take priority over all other operations. And that's not a lot to ask. That's the way that it should be.
It is not a state park. It is not a county park. It is not land owned by Malt or a ranching association. It is federal land owned by the people of the United States of America. And you would not think that based on the sense of control that the West Marin ranching community seems to believe they have over what is done out there. Closing lines, Laura?
Yeah, I just like to go back to the notion of carbon farming, which seems to be that you take a truckload of manure and dump it on a field that is full of weeds and leave it there. That's carbon farming as far as I can tell from my observations at Point Reyes. And then when we hopefully get a winter rainstorm in October, all that manure will just go wash into Kehoe Creek and Abbott's Lagoon and cause a spike in fecal coliform contamination and harm any California red-legged frogs, coho, salmon, steelhead trout, and human beings that happen to be in that water. So carbon farming on an organic dairy is just a lie. It's propaganda.
Julie?
We are in the middle of a biodiversity crisis. We are in the middle of a climate crisis. We can see that every day. It's accelerating. We have got to demand that on our public lands, those become the areas where wildlife can survive. That's their last stand. And so again, the highest standard must be put in place. So we are demanding that the leadership for these national parks, state parks, local lands, that they step up and protect our native wildlife within those parks. And it starts with Point Reyes. Point Reyes will become ground zero for modeling what should occur in the middle of a climate biodiversity crisis, especially when you have the pieces already there at Point Reyes. You got a chance. You got remnants of populations there that can help restore it. And if not at Point Reyes, then where?
Indeed, what a symbol for the greater battle. If we're going to use the idea that tradition is more important than saving animals here, or that we need even that little peninsula to produce food for the survival of human beings, if we need all of that land in a national park, then where do animals have a chance? Thank you both for joining me today. Thank you for all your help over the years in researching the creation of the shame of Point Reyes. And I look forward to seeing both of you out there again in the future.
Thank you for your great work. And thank you, Laura, for your great work as well. Nice job, team.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, I'll talk to you all soon.
Okay, bye, guys.